In this exciting tutorial, we're going to learn how to use the JavaScript Gamepad API. With this API, we're going to build our very own Gamepad tester. A Gamepad tester allows you to diagnose and figure out if anything is wrong with a controller. We're going to build this from scratch using JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. This is Coding with Adam, and let's get to the code. If you enjoy my videos, please subscribe, like, and share. Let's start with an overview of what we're going to be building. When our project first loads up, we're presented with this loading spinner. As soon as we press any button on our controller, we're presented with the grid showing us all the available buttons. As I press buttons on the controller, you're going to see that the controller is flashing red with the different buttons that are being pressed. The grid above is also updating with the value of that button, which is a number between 0 and 1. As I move the sticks around, you can also see that they're updated on the controller, which is perhaps one of the coolest features. If I push the sticks in, you can see that they change color and can also still be moved around. And the position of those sticks is represented by the axis number that we see in the grid. As you know, the triggers on a controller are pressure sensitive. As I lightly press the trigger, you're going to see it's going to go from a lightish red color all the way to a bright red color. And this is better represented in the grid. In the grid, as you can see, the number slowly increases until it goes all the way to 1. And you'll also see that we have this cool little meter on the side that represents how much of the trigger you have pressed. We can even test the rumble feature of the controller by checking this checkbox. So every time we press a button on the controller, it's going to go ahead and rumble. For this project, I'm going to be using VS Code, and I'm going to create 3 files, an index.html, an index.js, and a style.css. In the index.html file, we're going to go ahead and create the boilerplate HTML by putting an exclamation and then pressing tab. For the title, we'll go ahead and call it Gamepad Tester. Next, we'll go ahead and define an H1 called Gamepad Tester, and let's ensure that our project works. For this project, I'm going to be using an extension in VS Code called Live Server. So if you go to your extensions, you can just search for Live Server, install that extension, and once you have it installed, you can go back to your project, right-click, and say Open with Live Server, and then it will open up in your Chrome window. So I've taken my Chrome window over here and put it next to my VS Code. With Live Server running, anytime we make a change to one of our files and click Save, it'll automatically refresh your browser. We're going to continue by building out the HTML. We're going to add everything to the screen except these buttons, which are dynamically generated when the controller gets connected. We'll start by creating the div, which is our controller not connected area. Let's go ahead and create a div, and we're going to give it an ID of controller not connected area. We'll also define a class which we're going to use for styling, and that's going to be equal to our controller status, and we'll close that div off. Inside of this div, we're also going to have our loading spinner, and the way we're going to retrieve that is using CSS. So we're going to create a div with the class of loader, and then we'll just close our div off. The last part of our div is just some text that we want to add. We'll add the following text: controller not connected, press any button to start. Your HTML should now look like this. It looks rather boring since it's unstyled. If we go back to our game tester over here, the next section we're going to add is the connected area. So that's the green text and the checkbox. Below our controller not connected area, we'll define a div. We'll give it an identifier of controller connected area. Inside of that div, we're going to go ahead and define another div that is for the text. We'll give that an identifier of controller connected, and the text will simply be connected. Give it a class, and we're going to use exactly the same class that we had up above, the controller status. So they both have the same font, but will have different colors. And then let's go ahead and define our rumble area. We'll go ahead and create another div. Inside that div, we'll give an identifier of rumble on button press area. And then inside this div, we're going to go ahead and create an input. For the name, we're going to call it rumble on press. For the type, we're going to go ahead and use checkbox, and we'll close that input up. And then beside that input, we'd like to put a label. So we're going to use the label controller, and we're going to use the for. So anytime you click it, it's going to go ahead and select the label, and we'll give it the same value over here. So anytime you click on the text that's here, it'll automatically select the input. We'll close that up, and in between, we're going to put the text rumble on button press. Lastly, in the controller connected area, we're going to create a div, and that div is going to have an ID, and we're simply going to call it buttons. This is where we're going to create the dynamic list of buttons that we have when the controller is connected. For the actual controller, we're not going to type out that HTML for it as it's rather complicated. It's an SVG image made up of multiple parts, so we can easily identify each part and change the color. In the description of the video, you'll find a link to the controller SVG, and all you have to do is go to that link, click on raw, and then just select everything that's there. And once everything is copied, I'm going to go back to my HTML over here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to create another div over here. And this div is going to be where I'm going to put my controller. I'm also just going to give it a little helper class called center that we will be creating after in our styles. We'll paste in the controller and save. And now we have the controller showing up. You may notice in this tutorial that we're using a PlayStation controller. If you're using an Xbox controller or other generic controller, the buttons are still going to map to the right place. This also gives you an opportunity in the future to extend this code and show a different image depending on the type of controller you have. If we take a look at the HTML for our SVG image, you can see it's structured a lot like HTML, except we can draw an image with it. Now the key thing in here is the IDs for the various elements. I've very carefully labeled each element if it is a button as controller-B13, B8, B12. So it's the name controller-B with a number. For example, I'm going to scroll down to one of the circles over here, and I'm just going to add an attribute just as a test, and I'm going to give it the color green, save, and you'll see that it changes colors. Now in the JavaScript, we're going to do that dynamically as you press the buttons. Before we get to the JavaScript, let's go ahead and style our application. The first thing that we're going to need to do in our HTML is to link our style.css. We'll go into our head over here and we'll put our link to our style sheet. So it's link with a rel of style sheet and an href of style.css to link to our style.css file. Then we'll jump into our CSS file. Now for this part, I'm just going to be copying and pasting in these styles and explaining them so that we can move a little bit faster. Feel free to pause the video or copy the CSS from the completed project on GitHub. Let's start by styling the body. We're going to set the padding to 0 and the margin to 0. When I save that, you're going to see there's a little bit of tiny gray over here. This is this linear gradient we're applying to the background. Not required, but looks kind of cool. If you want to, you can even set that to a different color. Go ahead, save, and you'll see it. If this isn't working for you, this means that your style.css is not linked properly. Check your HTML, make sure that this is spelled correctly and matches the file name that you have, and then you should be good to go. Next, we can add the styling for our H1, which is going to make our H1 bigger and bolder. And if we recall, we had a class for center. We're going to go ahead and apply that. That's going to center our H1. It's also going to center our controller in the middle of the screen. And if you recall, around the not connected and connected area, we also had the controller status text, which is going to bold the text and center it on the screen as well. For the controller connected area, we're going to go ahead and set that text to green. By default, we're going to hide the controller connected area, so you'll see that disappear off the screen. When the controller's not connected, the text is going to be the color red. And then we have some additional styling over here for display flex and justify center, which will make more sense once we go ahead and add our loading spinner bar. And we'll go ahead and add some styling for the rumble on button press area. We're just adding 10 pixels below it. This is going to be more apparent once we add the grid for buttons. In our HTML, we created a div for our loading spinning bar. If we go back to our style CSS, I'm going to be adding the following CSS. Now it looks really complicated, and if you want to learn more about how to make your own spinning bar, go check out W3 School's article on how to create a loader. It'll teach you step by step the HTML and CSS to create your own loading spinner bar. This is the basic CSS that we need to get started. We'll add a bit more CSS once we start creating the buttons on the screen and we start using the controller. Now now we can start to work on our JavaScript. We're going to jump back to our index.html, and in the head tag over here, we're going to add our script tag, and it's going to link to our index.js. And you'll also notice that we have the defer attribute over here. And what the defer attribute will do is it'll wait to run our JavaScript once all the HTML has loaded. So instead of putting your script tag at the end of your body tag, you can put it in your head tag using the defer attribute. Now we can go to our index.js file, and the very first thing that we're going to do is just a console.log, and we're just going to ensure that our JavaScript file is linked up properly. So we can go to inspect, then go to console, and make sure that it prints out test. If it's not printing that out, go back to your index.html and make sure that it's referencing the file correctly. In order to program against our controller, JavaScript has a Gamepad API. The Gamepad API is going to allow us to detect when a controller is connected, disconnected, and also determine which buttons are pressed. To determine if the controller is connected or disconnected, there are two events. One for when the controller connects and another for when it disconnects. Both those events are available on the window. So we can use window.add event listener, and we'll add the first one for the Gamepad connected. Make sure to go ahead and spell this properly. And then we're going to use an arrow function. It's going to take in event, and inside that event, we're going to call a function that we're going to be creating called handle connect disconnect. And in that method, we're going to pass the event, and then we're going to pass a true or false variable to determine whether or not it's connected or disconnected. Then we can go ahead and copy this method over here, and we're just going to paste it below. And instead of Gamepad connected, we're going to switch this one over here to Gamepad disconnected. Once again, make sure to double check your spelling and make sure it's spelt correctly. And then in the handle connect disconnect over here call, we'll switch this to false for disconnected. Next, we'll go ahead and we'll create a function called handle connect disconnect. We'll pass in the event and connected. And then inside the function, we could simply just do a console.log of the connected value. Now I'm going to go ahead and press a button on my controller so that it's going to connect, and you'll see that it says true. And then I'm going to disconnect my controller by unplugging it, and it's going to say false. Now, if you're using Bluetooth, you can go ahead and disconnect the device from your Bluetooth menu and then reconnect it to Bluetooth to see the true and false. If you have any issues, make sure that you spelled the event correctly, Gamepad connected and Gamepad disconnected. Now we can go ahead and use the connected property to show and hide either the controller not connected area or the controller connected area. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get the HTML elements that we need. The first element that we're going to get is the controller not connected area. So we're just going to copy the ID over here. We'll create a variable called controller not connected area, and we're going to do get element by ID and pass in the element ID. And then we'll create another variable called controller area connected, and we'll do the same thing, document.getElement by ID. And then from the HTML, we're going to go ahead and copy the controller connected area ID and pass that in as well. If it is connected, that means we're going to go ahead and hide the not connected area. So we'll select the controller not connected area. And what we're going to do is we're just going to do a style.display, and we're going to set the display to none. Then we'll take our controller area connected, and we'll do the same thing with style.display, except this time we're going to make it equal to a block. And then in the else statement, when it's not connected, we're just going to do the opposite. So we're just going to copy those lines of code, put them over here. For the not connected, we'll put a block, and then we'll put a none over here. Then we can go ahead and test this by pressing a button on our controller, and you can see that we get the connected text. Now that we have our connected area, we can see that our rumble and button press isn't centered, so we can quickly go to our style CSS, find the rumble on button pressed area, add a text line of center. Now we can finish doing our test. If I disconnect the controller, you're going to see we get our spinner back and it says controller not connected. I'm going to go ahead and reconnect my controller, and we get the connected text once again. The next thing that we can do inside of our handle connect and disconnect is we can use our event object. From our event object, we can get a reference to the gamepad. We can go ahead and create a gamepad variable. And from the event, we'll go gamepad, and that will give us access to our gamepad. Let's take a look at our gamepad object in the console. So we'll open up the console once again, go to console, and what we'll do is I'll just hit a button on the controller. And when I hit a button on the controller, we have our gamepad over here. And from the gamepad, we get a lot of information about the controller. We get all of the different buttons, and for each button, we get to know whether it's pressed, touched, or the value. The value is actually one of the most important things that we'll be using. If it's 0, it's not being pushed. If it's 1, it is being pushed. We also get the axes. The axes are representing the sticks over here, and depending on the direction they're being pushed. The number for the axes go from -1 to 1, and we'll review this again once we get to the buttons. Next, you also have an ID, which gives you the name of the controller and the vendor. This information could be useful if you're trying to figure out which image to display for your controller. And then you also get this index. Now, what we're going to do when our controller connects, we're going to be storing a value, and that value is going to be the controller index. So at the top of the page over here, what we're going to do is we're just going to define a controller index, and we're going to set that to a default value of null. Then inside of our handle connect and disconnect, when the controller connects, we're going to say controller index, and we're going to set that to our gamepad.index value. And then when it disconnects, we're going to go ahead and set the index equal to null. For now, we're going to set the controller index aside, and we'll be using it later when we're figuring out which buttons are being pressed. The next thing that we're going to focus on is building out the button grid. The buttons grid that we're going to build out is rather dynamic. Every single controller can have a different number of buttons. If we take a look at the gamepad output over here, we can see that we have 18 buttons, but on other controllers, we may have more, we may have less. Whenever a controller gets connected, we're going to build out the button layout. So we're going to create a method called create button layout, and it's going to take in the gamepad.buttons, and we'll define that function below. So create button layout, take in a list of buttons, and those buttons are going to be placed in an area within our HTML called buttons. So if you recall, we added this little area over here with an ID of buttons. So we're going to go ahead and find that over here. We'll create a const button area is equal to document.getElement by ID, and we're going to pass in that name. Then the first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to clear the inner HTML just in case there's anything there, just in case you've reconnected and connected a different controller that has a different button layout. And then what we're going to do is we're going to loop over every single button. So just a simple loop with an I equal to 0, while I is less than the buttons length, and we're just going to increment our I by 1. Now inside this loop, what we're going to do is we're just going to append to the buttons area, and we're going to append some HTML. And to keep the code clean, we're going to create another method called create button HTML. We'll pass in the I and a default value of 0 for the button. Then below, we'll go ahead and we'll create that brand new function. That function, once again, is taking in the index and the value. And then inside here, we're going to have a whole lot of HTML. So I'm just going to paste this over here, and I'm going to explain exactly what this is doing. Now we're using string interpolation here. So we got a backtick at the beginning and the end. And then in between, we are passing the index in various spots and the value. So we start over here with the div, and we give it a class of buttons, so we can do some common styling among all of them. Then we give it an identifier of button-index. So let's say, for example, this button over here is index 1. Then what we would do in our code is we'd be looking for button-1 for one of these boxes to update its value. And then inside here, we also have this little bar that we draw, and this is used for the triggers. Whenever you push the trigger, the number can sometimes be variable, like B6 over here, this trigger that we're pressing, you can see it's variable. But if we push one of these other buttons, say for example, this one over here, you can see that it's not variable, it's only a 0 or 1. There actually was a controller that did have pressure sensitive face value buttons, and that was the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3. Now this is made up of two rectangles, one rectangle that's a gray like this, and then another rectangle that we move and position. Technically this rectangle is drawn, but then we move it up. You will notice that we have a Y of equal to 50 and a height of equal to 50, so that means it's putting it down here and then drawing it below, and we slowly move it up. This data dash original dash Y dash position we will be using later in the JavaScript. And then the last part is pretty simple. We just have our button text area div where we display the name using that index. So we just do B1, B2, B3. And then for the div over here, we just have a button value, and we're just fixing it to 2 decimal places like this so that it looks nicely formatted. Now, if we go ahead and press a button on our controller, you're going to see that it's adding the buttons on the screen, but they aren't styled just yet. So we can go to our style.css, and inside there, I'm going to add some styles. I'm going to start off by adding a button style. This represents our grid over here of buttons. So all the buttons will be inside here. And all we're doing is we're applying a grid, and then we're using a grid template to say that there are 8 items on a row, and we're adjusting its width for min and max. And then we're setting a gap between those items of 15 pixels. And we're going to justify its center, and we're going to justify the item's start. So we're placing this thing in the center of the screen. Then within each button, we're going to go ahead and format it and apply a gray background. We're going to give it a height of 50 pixels, a min width of 50 pixels, and we're going to use display flex inside our buttons. The other thing that we go ahead and do is we apply a button's text area, and we're going to add padding left of 10 pixels and 10 pixels. You can see this is a little bit squished here. So when we do that, we get the gap on either side. And the very last thing to bring this whole thing together is to change the color of these buttons here. So we go ahead and save that. You'll see that this becomes a light gray and the value of the button is more visible. Now that we have our button grid and our controller, let's go ahead and detect the buttons. In order to detect the buttons, there isn't any event that fires whenever a button is pressed on a controller. Instead, we can just poll and ask and say, hey, what's your current value right now, controller? And one way to do that is, well, in a loop. And if you're programming for a game, you're most likely going to have a game loop. So we're going to go ahead and create a game loop. And within that game loop, we're going to detect what buttons are being pressed on our controller. We'll start by creating a function, and we're going to name it game loop. And what we're going to do is we're just going to console log game loop as a little test. Below the game loop function, we can go ahead and call game loop. And if we were to look at our console right now, we would see that the game loop is only going to be called one time. To make the game loop call itself over and over, we're going to use request animation frame, which is only going to call the game loop function when it can draw the next frame of the screen. And now when we save, we'll see that the game loop is being called over and over. Inside the game loop, we're going to check if the controller index is not equal to null. If it's not equal to null, that means we can go ahead and get the gamepad. In order to do that, we're going to use navigator.getGamepads, which is going to give us a list of gamepads, and then we can use our controller index to get the controller that we want. Using our gamepad, we can then determine which buttons are being pressed. We'll create a function called handleButtons, and we'll use our gamepad to pass in the list of buttons. Above our game loop, we'll go ahead and define a function called handleButtons that takes in a list of buttons. In this function, we're going to start by looping over our buttons, and once again, we'll just do a simple for loop where I is less than our buttons.length, and we'll just increment I. And then inside the for loop, we're going to go ahead and get the value of the button. Buttons value is equal to buttons, and we're going to be using the array, and then we're going to get the value property. Then we're going to create a function called update button on grid. It's going to take in the index and the button value. Above that, we'll define a function. We'll call it update button on grid, takes in the index and the value. And what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and find the button area, which is going to be equal to our document.getAreaIndex element by ID. Now in our HTML that we have our button dash ID, and we have the index over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for button dash, and we just use a little bit of string interpolation to format our string and pass in the index value. Using our button area, we can then get the button value div. We'll define a variable called button value, and we're going to use our button area, and we're going to use the query selector to get us one item, and we're going to look for the button value, and we're just going to put a dot in front of that since we're looking for a class. Then we can go ahead and use our button value dot inner HTML, and we're going to set that to the value that we got from our button, and we're going to fix that to 2 decimal places. Let's go ahead and test this out. If I start pressing some buttons on my controller, you'll see that the values are changing to 1. Let's go ahead and try the trigger out, which is B6 over here, and you can see that it is incrementing and showing the correct value depending on how much I press the trigger. Next, we're going to implement showing the meter beside each button. So we need to go ahead and get another HTML element. So we could copy our button value line over here, and then below setting our value, we'll go ahead and just get our meter. So I'm going to rename this over here to meter, and then instead of looking for button value, we'll replace this with meter, and the meter comes from our SVG over here. It's the rectangle that we're drawing, and this is the black rectangle that's going to go on top of the gray rectangle. Using our meter, we're going to go ahead and get the meter height. To get the meter height, we're going to convert it to a number, and we're going to use button meter dot dataset dot original y position. You might be asking, where is this coming from? Well, on our button meter over here, we have this data dash original dash y dash position. And this is called a data attribute, a special type of attribute. What it does when you're retrieving it and you're going through the data set over here is it removes data, and all the dashes after the first word over here, original, it'll capitalize the y and capitalize the p, and you can get that value. We're going to use the meter height as our original starting position, as the y position can change over time as you're pressing your buttons. Next, we're just going to do a little bit of math to figure out what the meter position is. We'll define a variable called meter position. We're going to take our meter height, and then we're going to minus, and in brackets, we're going to use our meter height divided by 100. So we're taking our height and divide it into 100 pieces, because technically our value goes from 0 to 1, which can also be 100 pieces. So we take our value for our button and also times that by 100, so we're working at the same scale. Once we perform that calculation, we can figure out where the meter is. So we can take our button meter dot set attribute, and we're going to change the y attribute on our SVG over here, so for the rectangle, and we're going to say that y value is now equal to the meter position. Then we can go ahead and test our controller out, and now if we push buttons on our controller, you'll see that the meter goes up. If I press the triggers, they only go slightly up. I can hit a whole bunch of buttons at the same time. And what's really great about this grid over here is I can learn which buttons are which on my controller and then map them to this controller over here. I've already done the job of mapping those buttons to this controller through the identifiers that we have in the SVG over here. If we take a look at it, we can see that we have controller -B3. Now all we have to do is look up the buttons and then change the color of it. In order to do that, we're going to need a little style that we're going to add and remove to each button. We'll just go to our styles and we'll add a brand new style called selected button. I have it as red over here, but you can select any color that you like. We'll go back to our index.js, and inside our handle buttons, we're going to go ahead and call a brand new method called update controller button that takes in the index and the button value. And then we'll define that function up above, update controller button, which takes in the index and the value. And then inside this method, just like our other methods, we're going to go ahead and we're going to find that button. Now, as you recall, the buttons have a common name among them. It's controller-b. And then the index of the button. So all we have to do is look for document.getElements element by ID, and we'll just use string interpolation again. And then for that last part over there, we'll just use the $ brackets, and we're going to pass in the index to find the button. And then I'm just going to define a constant over here called selected button class, and it's just going to be equal to the name of the class that we created inside our styles. So I'm just going to copy this name over here, and then I'm going to paste it over here because we're going to be using it twice and no point duplicating it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to check if the button exists. Now the buttons may not always exist on the controller, so I want to double check that it's an actual HTML element that is there. Then we're going to check if the value is greater than 0. If the value is greater than 0, then we're going to highlight the button with our selected button class. And the way we're going to do that, we'll just do button.classList.add. And we're going to pass in the selected button class that we created right over here. And then if we go to our else, if the value isn't greater than 0, then we're going to go ahead and remove that class. So I just copied that, and now I'll just do a remove. So we'll add the class if it's greater than 0 and remove it if it's less than 0. Let's go ahead and test this out. If I press buttons on the controller, you can see that they are being pushed. I can even push the sticks in and the arrow buttons. However, when I press my triggers, they go immediately to red. Let's update that so it goes from a light color to a brighter color. Within our update controller button inside the if statement, we're going to go ahead and take our button and apply a style called a filter. The filter that we're going to use is called contrast. Contrast takes in a percentage. We're going to use the value of our button, and we're going to times it by 200. We're going to times it by 200 to increase our contrast. Then in our else statement, when we don't have a button value that's greater than 0, we're going to set the contrast to 100%. Let's go ahead and test that by slightly pressing the trigger button. And as I do, you can see it's a light color. And as I continue to press it, it gets brighter and brighter. Next, we're going to go ahead and handle the sticks. So we're going to go back to our game loop over here. And under the handle buttons, we'll go ahead and call handle sticks, which is a new method that we're going to create. And we're going to pass in the gamepad.axes. We'll create the function above the game loop, and it's going to take in the axes. The axes is an array made up of 4 values for this controller since we have 2 sticks. The first 2 values in the array are going to be for the left stick, and the next 2 values are going to be for the right stick. The 2 values basically represent the left and right movement and the up and down movement. The sticks in our image over here are represented in our HTML by circles in the SVG. So for example, we have controller B10, which is the left stick, and controller B11, which is the right stick. If we go to our index.js, what we're going to do is we're going to create a method called updateStick. And this is going to be responsible for updating one stick. So the first stick that we're going to update is B10, which is the left stick, and we're going to pass in axes 0. And axes 0 is the left to right movement. Its value is going to be -1 if it's on the left, and it's going to be +1 if it's on the right. Then the second value that we're going to pass in is the up and down movement, which once again is going to be a number between -1 and 1. And then we'll call this method, which we haven't created yet, once again. So we'll just copy that and duplicate it. And we're going to change the controller B10 to controller B11, axes 0 to 2, and axes 1 to 3. We'll go ahead and create the function updateStick, which is going to take in an element ID, which is the string, and then the left to right axis and the up down axis. Inside updateStick, I'm going to define a multiplier. So this is a number that we're going to use to multiply the axes numbers that we have. So first we're going to define our stick left right, and we're going to take our left right axes and we're going to times that by our multiplier, and then we'll do the same thing for our up down. So we'll define and stick up down is equal to the up down axes times the multiplier. This is what the values that we're going to be using when we draw it to the screen. Now, kind of like what we did with our meters earlier, we do have values for the original position of the circle. If we look at our index.html, HTML, there is a data-original X position 200, and this just matches the position within the grid and where we're drawing it, so we can always go back to the center. And the same thing with the Y position over here. Using our element ID, we can go ahead and find the stick. So we just use the document.getElement by ID, and we pass in the element ID that we got from our parameters. And then from our stick, we're going to go ahead and get the original position of the stick. And we're going to do that by doing stick.dataset.originalXposition. We can then go ahead and duplicate this line, and we'll just rename this to Y. And then over here where it says original X position, we'll grab the original Y position. Then all we're going to do is set the position of the X and Y of the stick. So we're going to use set attribute, and we're going to use CX for a circle. And we're going to take the original resting position X where it sits in the middle. And then we're going to use the new left and right multiplier that we created. So we're going to do left, right over there. And then we're going to do the same thing for the Y. So we're just going to duplicate that line, rename it to CY, Y. Then instead of stick left, right, it's going to be stick up, down. And now perhaps the coolest part, you're able to move the sticks on the controller. Before we move on to rumbling the controller, I'm going to quickly show you how you can add the axes numbers within this grid. Much like our button grid, we have to do this when the controller is first connected. In the handle connect disconnect method, when we are connected, we're going to go ahead and call a new method called create axes layout. It happens right after the button layout. We'll define this function over here next to the create button layout. And what this function does is it finds the button area, then it loops over the axes. And as it's looping over the axes, it's adding those axes to the same button area where other buttons are. And that HTML that it's adding is fairly simple as well. It has an identifier, and we identify each axis by its index. So we do axes-i. We're also applying some styling as well, and we're showing at least 4 decimal points for the value of the number. You can go ahead and test this code out, and you can see that it's now displaying our axes. It doesn't look too nice, so let's go ahead and style it. If we go to our style.css over here, we can add 2 styles, one for the axes name and one for the axes value. The next thing we have to do is display the values as you move your stick. You can see right now I'm moving the stick and they're not updating. So we'll go down to our handle sticks method, and inside the handle sticks method, we're going to call a new method called update axes grid, which will be responsible for updating those values in the grid. We'll implement that method over here. And in this method, what we're doing is we're looping over the axes. And then for each axis, we're getting the axis value div by looking for the index of axis-i and then .axes value. And then we're replacing the inner HTML with the value of that axis. Now, if we test this out over here, you're going to see that the numbers are continuously moving. This is just something that PlayStation controllers do. Xbox controllers may not do this, at least with the ones I tested. However, I find if we put this if statement, which creates a little dead zone and only detects the controller when it goes beyond those values, then those numbers won't update quite as erratically. However, I'm only keeping this in just for the video. Normally, I would leave this out just so I could see what's always happening with the controller. And if we look very closely at those sticks, you can kind of see them wobbling. It's very hard to tell, but just a little quirk that I found out while building this controller tester. And if we go ahead and we move the sticks around, you can see that the value when I'm here is -1. When I go all the way to the right is 1. And if we look at the up and down, which is axis 1, you can see it goes -1 when it's all the way up and then 1 when it's all the way down. And the same thing with our right stick. The very last thing that we're going to handle is the rumble on button press. So we're going to go down to our game loop and we're going to add another handle method, this time handle rumble, and we're going to pass in the gamepad. Go ahead and create our handle rumble function. Inside this function, we're going to go ahead and get the rumble on button press checkbox by using document.getElement by ID. Then what we're going to do is check if our rumble on press has been checked. When it is checked, we're going to go ahead and check our gamepad, and we're going to look at all the buttons and see if any of them are being pressed by using the sum method. And the way that works is it's going to find the first thing that's going to return return true. So we're going to go to each button, check the value, see if it's greater than 0. If it is greater than 0, then it will stop and return a true. And then inside this if statement, all we're going to do is call the gamepad.vibration actuator, which will cause the controller to rumble. It has several settings that you can use. I set the start delay to 0. Duration is in milliseconds, so that's 25 milliseconds. And I set the weak magnitude and strong magnitude to 1.0. So you're going to get a strong jolt as soon as you push a button on your controller. Then we'll go ahead and test it out just to make sure it works. If I click this, and as soon as I click a button, I feel a jolt from the controller. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and learned a lot about the Gamepad API. If you did, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell.